So I'd like to actually bring our meeting to order tonight. Looks like we've got about 46 people and a few more coming in still. We've got a great program tonight that came together quickly thanks to the efforts of Barbara Burt. And I think most people on the committee know who Barbara Burt is, but he's been really a long time ago a chair of this committee and has been a tremendous force on chairing our campaign committee for several years now. And she has a history of doing work in DC around voting rights and all. So she was a perfect host and moderator for the discussion with our two guests tonight. So I'm going to turn things over to Barbara Burt to lead us through the program.
Thanks, Chris. As Chris said, this came together very quickly, and I think we just started talking about it a week ago, and I really thank our two guests for being willing to come and talk with us on such short notice. I am very excited to hear what they have to say about elections and voting. As Chris mentioned, I worked at Common Cause in DC back around 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, and was in charge of the national election reform group there. And at that time, we were really concerned about DREs, and I don't know if you all remember that, but those were the electronic voting machines that's called direct recording machine. They didn't have a paper trail at all, so there was no way to do an audit or to check to make sure that the vote that you cast was actually the vote that was counted. And luckily that the number of those machines has really dropped. There are still some in some states, but obviously not in Maine. We don't have them here. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was to be in a coalition with groups like the League of Women Voters, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, NAACP, groups that had a lot of different election and voting issues that they were working on. And it makes me a little sad to think that we are still fighting for those rights. And in fact, that some of them were rolled back by the Supreme Court, as I'm sure we'll talk about. The other thing I want to tell you that was really a fun thing for me was that when John Koza, who was a graduate of Stanford University and a computer scientist who made a lot of money because he figured out how to make programs for state lotteries, and he invented the scratch card. He came to Common Cause to present this great idea that he had that he thought would really help the state of democracy in the country. And Common Cause is a nonpartisan group. In fact, it was started by a Republican. So he was not thinking about this from a partisan standpoint. But what he was there to tell us about was something that he called the national popular vote. And I think that will talk about that with us. That is something that is going to be coming up for a vote here in Maine. It came up last year and did not quite pass. And we're hoping that this year we'll be able to get it over the hump. But the first person who's going to talk to us, and we're so lucky to have her because she's a very busy person, is our new Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows. One thing I should tell you is that Shenna is going to have a birthday in 5 days, which is very fun. So you can all wish her happy birthday. She is our 50th Secretary of State in the state of Maine. A little bit about her background in case you don't know her. She was for 8 years the executive director of the Maine ACLU. She ran for the US Senate against Susan Collins in 2014, which was a very brave thing to do. And she ran a very good campaign, unfortunately not successful. She was the executive director of the Maine Holocaust Center. She was in younger years a Peace Corps volunteer in Panama. And then most recently, she was a state senator from her hometown of Manchester, Maine, until she was done with her 4 terms. So it was very great that the legislature elected her to become our Secretary of State. So she's still around and still working on the issues that she really cares about. So I'm going to welcome Shenna to talk with us, and then there'll be time for questions after she makes her presentation.
I'm very sorry, but I need to interject because I didn't say so earlier, just to let everyone know we are being recorded. Take it away, Shenna. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Barb, and thank you, Chris. It is a joy to be with you here tonight. The Lincoln County Dems were allies when I was head of the ACLU, and we were leading the way on marriage equality and then restoring same-day voter registration. So some of you may recall when one of my predecessors, Charlie Summers, and the then Republican-controlled legislature eliminated same-day voter registration, and we brought the people's veto to restore it. So it's really wonderful to be in this virtual room with all of you tonight. And I'm here to talk about voting rights. And I think that we are an incredibly important moment in our democracy. When we look at what is happening across the country, we saw record turnout in 2020, both here in Maine, but also nationally. And the response, unfortunately, has been efforts to restrict and suppress the right to vote all across the country. So it's vitally important that we safeguard that fundamental constitutional right that is preservative of all other rights and really fundamental to everything else that we care about by advancing the right to vote. And so I want to talk a little bit about H.R.1, the For the People Act, introduced and passed in the House with the support of both Representative Pingree and Representative Golden, and now introduced in the Senate this week and before the Senate for consideration. That is S1. And for the political junkies in the room, it is highly unusual for both the House and the Senate to privilege the same bill with the same number 1. And it's an indication of the priority that leadership is placing on restoration of American democracy. And it's incredibly important. So why is H.R.1 so important and what does it do? Well, first and foremost, it sets a federal floor for certain elections procedures. And some of those reforms are things that we have done in Maine for a very long time, like Election Day registration, which is really exciting, like early voting. Now, Maine doesn't technically have early voting, but we have a 30-day window for in-person absentee voting and for voting itself. And this H.R.1 would extend the voting window to 15 days prior to the election and would mandate early voting nationwide, which is somewhat exciting for me as secretary, because here in Maine, we've been trying to advance a constitutional amendment for quite some time to permit actual early voting, where people could vote at the municipal clerk's office in the manner that they do on election day, placing their ballot into the machine. So because of the supremacy clause, should H.R.1 pass, early voting would take place. That would be a reform that would be possible here in Maine. We are all fundamentally aware of structural white supremacy and structural racism in our society, and H.R.1 makes an extraordinary step forward by restoring voting rights for people who are formerly incarcerated. And of course, Maine is one of 2 states in the country, Vermont being the other, where every citizen is guaranteed the right to vote, regardless of whether they're currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. So that's a really exciting aspect. Maine has no excuse absentee voting, and H.R.1 would put that in place again across the country. So those are some of the aspects of H.R.1, taking some of what we do so well in Maine and bringing it to the national level. But Maine wasn't number 1 in voter participation in the country. We were only number 3. We had 75% voter turnout. 62% of those voters voted absentee, but Colorado came in second and Minnesota came in first. So my goal is to be number one. My goal is to see, let's leave 75% on the by the wayside and aspire for more participation. And so to do that, we really need to think about what are the things we could do better in Maine. So there's some very exciting bills in the legislature. One of those is Speaker Ryan Fecto's bill for ongoing absentee voting. So if you think about it, that process of requesting an absentee ballot, that application process can be a barrier. And there are voters, particularly seniors and voters with permanent disabilities, who request an absentee ballot year after year. Speaker Fecto's bill would permit the creation of a permanent list of ongoing absentee voters who could then receive automatically that ballot in every election thereafter. So again, it's just reducing barriers to the right to vote. There's another exciting bill that I've been working with Will, who's your next speaker, on, and that is a bill to enact online voter registration. Because if you think about it, the idea that you have to fill out a paper card in 2020 is somewhat antiquated. And as we think about recruiting young people to get involved in the process, they should be able to register to vote from their phone or their computer. And so online voter registration is a terrific tool that I'm really excited about bringing to Maine. It's one of my top goals as Secretary of State, is technology modernization and leveraging technology to increase participation. Automatic voter registration is a reform that already passed in the last legislature. I was a proud original sponsor in my first term and then a co-sponsor with then Speaker Gideon in my second term, watching it pass into law. Now as secretary, I get to oversee the implementation of automatic voter registration at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. And what that would look like is when you go to the BMV to renew your license or secure a license for the first time for young people or people moving to the state, on a keypad, you'd be presented with an opt-out. Do you want to opt out of registering to vote today? And if you're like, no, I want to register to vote, then the information that we already possess at the BMV would be used to automatically enroll the voter in the right as a Maine registered voter. So again, incredibly exciting, especially for populations that may not be connected to some of the traditional structures, may not know where the municipal clerk's office is, but they've come to the BMV. And so we're capturing them in that moment. So those are some of the exciting things that are in H.R.1 that we're not yet doing, but I'm thrilled to implement. I ran for Secretary of State with a goal of technology modernization and a second goal of equity and inclusion, because our state government is still not fully representative of the communities that comprise Maine. We can do so much more to be welcoming and inclusive in state government, to be making sure that Black, Indigenous, and people of color, especially in making sure that our new Mainers feel welcome and included. So that's another chief goal of my tenure as Secretary of State. So I will close by we're going to have this really fun conversation. I'm very excited about it. And I'll be pitching it, I think, back to Barb and then to Will. But I had a wonderful opportunity as secretary. There's a network of National Association of Secretaries of State, and there's a Democratic Association of Secretaries of State. And that network is incredibly mutually supportive. So they welcomed me in my first week on the job. And we had conversations, we have frequent conversations about what is happening in each person's state. And the assault on democracy, the insurrection of January 6th, was an event that shocked everyone, but also sparked some profound conversations about how we safeguard our democracy. We had a national conference in which we spoke with members of Congress, and we talked to them about H.R.4, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would restore some of the safeguards for voting rights for African Americans and other traditionally marginalized communities. And we talked about H.R.1. And so then I was invited by Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren to testify before Congress to Maine's experience on voting rights in support of H.R.1. That was so incredibly meaningful, a wonderful opportunity to get to talk about how Maine leads. And so my exhortation or invitation to all of you is to be part of that change. When we look at what's happening nationally and we feel frustrated or afraid, we can, in fact, make a difference by encouraging and supporting and really creating the grassroots movement for the passage of S1 so that we can truly restore our voting rights and save our democracy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shenna. Now we're going to have time for questions for Shenna, and I'm going to just tell you about the questioning process here. I've got a little document to read. If you have a question, please unmute yourself, and that will put you at the top of the attendance list, so I'll see that. And when I recognize you, then you can ask your question. If you know how to use the raise hand feature, then that will work too. If you're using the phone, you'll press *9 to raise your hand. And when I call your name, if you're on the phone, press *6 to unmute. And if you'd like to submit a question anonymously, you can just do it in the chat to me directly, Barb Burt, rather than just to everyone. And Shenna, there's a question already here in the chat. Oh, I see Shenna has put a link to her testimony up as well. So you might want to grab that from the chat, her testimony to Congress. There's a question, will there be acknowledgement or confirmation to the person who gets registered automatically? And will it include information for them about where they actually can vote, where their voting location is, their poll location?
That's an excellent piece of feedback. So we are at this point acquiring the technology for the touchpads at the BMV. If you've been to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles lately, you'll know that a lot of our technology is somewhat outdated, and we don't yet have those touch screens for even processing of your credit card. And so we're in the process of acquiring that technology. An important step will be coding that technology and exchanging for the data transfers between the licensed databases and the central voter registration database. But another critical component, and I'm so glad you're asking this question in this moment, is what is the user experience and what are the instructions that are provided to the user, and then what is the output that the user receives. So at this point in time, the feature does not include our printer per se, but this is a good conversation for me to bring back to the Secretary's office to talk about, can we put in place an email function that results in some follow-up information to the voter, or a text message function that results in follow-up information. So we're in the beginning stages of implementation as we move through technology procurement for the equipment side of things, and then comes the education side of things. So
good, fun that we can have some input at that point. That's
absolutely great. It's not a done deal yet.
No.
The target date is next January for going live. It's been an educational process for me, working through state procurement processes, working in the confines of our budget limitations, and also learning what's out there. And one of the perspectives that I've been bringing to the office is encouraging the team to reach out to other states, because we are not first to do this, or our neighbors in Vermont, for example, and Connecticut have a lot to share in terms of how they implemented automatic voter registration. Similarly, with online voter registration, most states have online voter registration. Maine is actually, unfortunately, very behind the rest of the country in that area because of limitations in terms of technology funding over time.
Okay, so I see that there is a question from Marty. So Marty, go right ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you, Shenna. I was wondering how Senator Collins stands on HR1. And
She's not yet spoken out publicly on HR1. I think it's an important moment to be reaching out to her. And you know, it's interesting. Same-day voter registration, for example, was originally a Republican proposal in Maine. In 1973, Representative, I believe it was Rodney Ross from Bath, brought forward same-day voter registration. This was a Republican-controlled legislature at the time. She, of course, was working then for Senator Bill Cohen. And so I think that's an important point to impress upon her and Republicans in Congress, is that many of these measures are not partisan measures. They're not inherent benefits to same-day voter registration to Democrats. It's a question of which party has the most enthusiasm and has generated the most excitement in and around Election Day and reaching those infrequent voters or people who might not otherwise be registered.
Thank you.
Here's another question from the chat. Let's see. With all the good news about Maine voting, can we assume the efforts to suppress voting are not happening in Maine?
We cannot assume that the efforts to suppress voting are not happening. And I'll give you one example, and that is voter ID. There are multiple voter ID bills. And you know, sometimes people will say, well, what's the big deal? I have to show an ID when I go to the grocery store to purchase liquor. Well, two things. First and foremost, purchasing liquor is not a fundamental constitutional right that is preservative of all other rights. And second, we know that voter ID is an instrument of white supremacy, that if I go to the polls and gosh, I've forgotten my wallet, I am less likely to be challenged and to be prohibited from either casting an affidavit or, oh, come on, Shenna, we know who you are, going ahead and voting. The data demonstrates that voter ID is used to disproportionately suppress the votes of Black voters and voters of color. And so I think that is a proposal that rears its ugly head every single year. And in an environment where we as advocates and I as Secretary of State cannot just go to the legislature and talk to people one-on-one, those traditional relationship tools are missing. And so it's going to be increasingly important that the grassroots be communicating with members of the legislature, hugely important. And particularly around issues like voter ID, where there's this intersectionality between voter suppression and structural racism.
Okay, so don't take it for granted.
Yes, don't take it for granted.
Here's another question. As constituents, if our legislators are resistant to online voter registration or ongoing absentee ballot voting, what are some of the compelling arguments that we can make to help convince them?
So I think that there are a couple of, one, when I worked at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine, which by the way is doing extraordinary work, and we partnered with Southern Poverty Law Center, and we often talked about how one confronts statements that are rooted in hate or misunderstanding or prejudice. And I think the technique of questioning to understand before educating is really important. So I think first and foremost, it's to try to understand where they're coming from. So if it's concerns about the technological limitations, then sharing with them perhaps data about how it's been successful in other states. If it's concern about favoring one party or another, again, maybe it's demonstrating the states or sort of exploring that with them, because again, the systems and structures themselves are not partisan in any way. But most often these days, it's probably rooted in concerns about security. And so one of the efforts we've been making with the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee is to really ground committee members in a crystal clear understanding of how things work. So Maine is a paper-based state, for example. So when we talk about online voter registration, we're not talking about online voting. There is a paper ballot in Maine. Even ballot transmissions for overseas voters or for voters with print disabilities who are permitted to transmit their ballot electronically, there's still a paper product, something that can be audited or recounted, and something that cannot be hacked. Our tabulators, which are ES and S machines, those tabulators are not networked to the internet. They can't be hacked by outside or malicious or foreign actors. The security measures that we have in place for the central voter registration are extraordinarily rigorous. That data is backed up. So should online voter registration create some sort of conduit for some sort of cybersecurity breach, the data itself is protected and we could restore that and come back online. So I think that's some of the issue, or people are concerned about voter impersonation, right? That is one of the chief concerns, is that people are going to pretend to be someone else. Interestingly enough, back in 2011, when Charlie Summers was bringing these efforts to suppress the vote, he convened a voter fraud commission that did a study of fraud in Maine, and they couldn't find any.
Yeah.
And so, and there are checks and balances, because those, you know, when you go to the polls and you say your name and your address and they check you off on a list, that's the voter participation list. And that gets checked and reconciled against the totals of ballots. And there's a similar list for absentee ballot applications and ballots that come back. So every single person who casts a vote is carefully tracked. Shenna Bellows or John Smith can't vote over and over and over again. If somebody were to try to do that, they would be caught and prosecuted. It would be a felony.
One question I have, actually, Shenna, is about the clerks who often in small towns, and Lincoln County is made up primarily of very small towns, the clerk who handles elections handles all sorts of things and may only work part-time as well. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of training that they get and any thoughts that you have around that?
So one of the wonderful things about being Secretary of State is having a window into how things work. And one of the things that has been remarkably impressive to me is that the clerks are meeting regularly. We're talking to the clerks every week about elections issues. There's a very thorough reporting process that happens post-election by each clerk to the Secretary of State. And then there's some post-election surveys that take place. And we actually just this week had a conversation about those survey results, about the experience of the election. Prior to the election, there are very detailed policies and procedures that are distributed, and also trainings from the Secretary of State's office for the clerks. It's true, the clerks have a huge job. They do an extraordinary job. And I think certainly there's still more that we could do to be supportive. It's interesting to me because as the administrator of the BMV, the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, because clerks process your vehicle registration and the like, we have a small department called Municipal Services, and their job is every day to be on the phone with clerks, helping them with some of the challenges of vehicle registration or whatnot. So I said to Julie today, I sent her a note and I said, I'm asking for municipal services, a municipal services team for you. Julie Flynn is our Deputy Secretary of State, our Chief Elections Administrator.
She knows everything.
She does. And so I do think there's always more that we can do to be supportive, but I've been very impressed by that expertise. Now, Maine is unique. A lot of states administer elections at the county level rather than the municipal level. So Maine is one of, in New England, you find more, Vermont is also municipal run. New England government doesn't depend on county government in the same way. And that is actually one of the technical amendments we're suggesting to H.R.1, because H.R.1, has, for example, a provision that says there needs to be an absentee ballot box in every county with more than 20,000 people. Well, you don't want a Lincoln County drop box. Can you imagine if everybody from from Lincoln County were, dropping their ballots in the same box, and then we were trying to frantically somehow return them to the originating municipalities, right? So, one of the technical amendments that we discussed with Senator King's staff is making sure that it's clear in S1 that it's both counties or, municipalities. So there are things like that that make Maine a little bit unique, but it also makes things a little more complicated because we have over 500 election administrators, where many states have election centers or county-based operations.
So I think this will be the last. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Ina has her hand up. So Ina, why don't you go ahead and ask a question?
Okay. Hi, Shenna. Thank you for being here and explaining to us. I have a question on the training. Are they also being trained in cultural competencies or at least awareness? Because some of my friends in smaller towns, I mean, not me myself, are having difficulties with their strong accent and spelling their names even. And I know that a couple of them have left the voting place without going through the voting process.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
And that should never happen.
Right.
So
they're citizens.
Yep.
And they have their identification, but when they were asked how to spell their names, sometimes they have difficulties.
So I'm so glad you've raised this issue. It's really important to me. Equity and inclusion is one of my top 2 goals as Secretary of State. And to that end, one of my first appointments was my Deputy Secretary of State Policy Advisor is the first Latina Deputy Secretary of State in Maine, Joanne Bautista, and the daughter of immigrants, and an attorney as well. So I have tasked her with working with me and the Secretary of State's office to work with us to develop recommendations to the legislature to evaluate the proposals through a racial equity lens. And I was very proud to testify in support of LD2, for example, that would require racial impact statements, extraordinarily important legislation. And then I've also, on the Bureau of Motor Vehicles side, I've been thinking quite a bit about licensing and credentialing for immigrant and refugee communities. And I reorganized part of that department and appointed a deputy secretary for branch operations, equity and inclusion, Patty Morneau, with an explicit mandate to evaluate how we're being welcoming and inclusive at the BMV. So this is something I'm very much committed to. And I think you raise a really important point that as I'm thinking about public services, although I do not oversee the clerks, they are independent. The Secretary of State has no authority, direct authority over them. But we could take what we develop for our BMV branch employees, for example, and perhaps incorporate that into our training. And I'm just thrilled that you suggested it before I've even had the opportunity to oversee a training for clerks, because it's an excellent idea and I'm really excited about it.
Thank you very much.
So I think it's time for us to bring Will Hayward in, and we'll let Shenna take a breather here for a little bit. Thank you so much, Shenna. That was really interesting, and I think we had a lot of good questions for you too. So that was super. So Will Hayward is now going to join us. Will is the Advocacy Program Coordinator for Democracy Maine. And Democracy Maine is an interesting organization because it's a combination of 2 Maine nonprofits. One is the League of Women Voters of Maine, which has been around for 100 years, I guess. and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, which hasn't been around quite as long, but has been very successful advocating for the Clean Elections program, which our candidates often use. Will is originally from Virginia, and he had the great luck to move to Maine last February, just as the state and the country shut down. But he claims to like it very much, and I hope you will all welcome him. Will's going to tell us about the advocacy kind of things that we can do to help Shenna achieve the goals that she set before us, and other things too, possibly, right, Will?
Yes, that's right. Well, thank you so much for having me, Barb, and thanks to everyone for coming tonight. It's really a pleasure to get to follow Secretary Bellows in speaking tonight. I'd encourage everyone to go watch her testimony before the House on H.R.1. It's really great. I know all of us were watching and just, beaming with pride that Maine was so well represented in that hearing. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the advocacy priorities that Democracy Maine is working on. And as Barb said, that's a collaboration between the League of Women Voters of Maine and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections. And so what we do, it's always interesting, every legislative session, particularly the odd numbered year ones, we see this list of 1,800 titles come in, and we go through, we wonder what they're going to be, the bills finally print, and then we go into them, we look at them, we do very intensive, policy analysis of them, and we do aim to testify on almost every democracy-related bill, particularly those that come before the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee, which deals with elections and campaign finance. But that's not all we do. Testimony isn't nearly the half of it. What's really important is the role we play. I should say both these organizations are nonpartisan organizations, and so what we do is we go to people all around the state, interested organizations such as you all, and we educate on the issues that we are advocating on. We encourage people to take action. I'm going to talk a little bit about what kinds of things are especially helpful for each bill, but it'll be a common theme. Letters to the editor, contact your legislator, sign up to testify. But there's, it's really important that legislators hear what is important to Mainers. I can't tell you how many conversations I've already had where someone said like, yeah, I wasn't sure, but then I just got so many calls from constituents and I felt like I had to. And it's a gift of Maine that our legislature, the size of the districts is such that you can really form good connections with your legislators, really have great conversations. So that's all just a backdrop. Some of the bills I'm about to talk about, and I'll be pretty brief because I want to leave some time for any questions that you all might have. So I'm going to talk just very briefly about 4 bills that Democracy Maine, between the League of Women Voters and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, is working on. And this first one I can be very brief on because we've already touched on it quite a bit, but it is online voter registration. As has already been said, Maine is one of 10 states that does not currently have online voter registration. I think that this is something that we've known is a good idea and increases access to registration for a long time, but the pandemic really made clear that having a way to be able to register from home is really important. And even as in-person activities begin to resume, it's still so important to have that, and also just to be ready for any future time where activities may be disrupted. So that's just to say that we are very excited about this bill. I think that Secretary Bellows did a great job of discussing what's in it, how it functions. I'll just mention that the bill was printed today, and I posted that link in the chat. So it is LD 1126. So if anyone is contacting your legislator, you can reference that number and they'll know to go and look it up there. A couple of other things we're looking for in particular on this. We'd love to get some letters to the editor published in local papers all around the state, talking about how great this would be. And I'm happy to provide any materials. I'll put my email in once I turn it over to questions. So anyone can email me with any questions you have. And then, just telling your legislators to prioritize this. I think one thing this year that's going to be interesting is that while I would say generally, we feel like people inherently understand the need for online voter registration, we need legislators to know it's urgent, that it needs to be funded right now. So we are really encouraging people to go out and tell them that specifically. So the second bill I'd like to talk about is one that many of you may be familiar with. It's the National Popular Vote. As I think was mentioned earlier, this bill nearly passed in 2019, and we're hoping to really get some momentum on it this year. So just very short, very brief, I could and do and invite any of you to invite me to talk about the National Popular Vote for an hour or more. But in very short, it's a proposal that ensures that whatever candidate gets the most votes for president across all 50 states and DC is the one elected president. And it works by having states join this compact, and when a number of states equaling to the majority of electoral votes, 270 electoral votes, joins, then it goes into effect, and states in it cast their electors for the candidate that gets the most popular votes across the country. Currently, it's at 196 electoral votes. So I always like to say that if Maine got the next 4, we'd hit 200, and we'd put it at this really important threshold that would be, hugely symbolic. So I'm sure there are questions about it that you all have, and I'm happy to answer those. It's certainly, the things that you often hear said about it, there's so many myths. I could spend so much time debunking them about how, candidates would only go to big states. It would be New York and LA. And all of these I can say are demonstrably untrue. But I'm happy to answer any specific questions you have, but I'll just say that, the most important thing we find on this issue in particular is educating both the public and legislators. So we really, one thing we are, I would say, especially focused on with this bill right now is going around the state and talking to different groups about the National Popular Vote, answering questions, encouraging people to contact their lawmakers, all of that. It's going to be really important for making this a reality, because as I said, last time it came very close. It came within 5 votes of passing the House, but it didn't quite get there. So we're hoping to come back with more energy this year and help make it a reality. The next thing I'm going to briefly talk about is something that we're doing on the Maine Citizens for Clean Elections side, and that's a ban on corporate contributions to political candidates. So this is another one where Maine leads in so many areas of campaign finance in particular. I know Secretary Bellows talked quite a bit about our public financing, our clean elections program in her testimony, and it's something we're very proud of. It's in the name of the organization. But one thing that Maine does not do is we do not prohibit corporate contributions to political candidates here. This is something that's banned in 22 states and at the federal level. So it's something that really, feels like it's time, and it's something that hasn't come up as much because Maine does have relatively low contribution limits and other things like that. But at this time where there's this sense from people that their government is not fully representing them, we think it's really important to get this corporate money out and to help return elections to the people. And just very briefly, you all may have seen some coverage of the foreign contribution bans that were heard before the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee earlier this week. And I will briefly just say that we are, fully supportive of these. There's a couple of different bills in, and we're supporting all of them. But that is also distinct from the corporate contribution ban, which again, the thing we are really looking for is people to contact their legislator, to write letters to the editor. So I'll share plenty of information on how to do that. And then the final bill I'll mention is the bill for semi-open primaries. And this is something that Senator Maxman is actually sponsoring. And this is something that we think is really important. So in short, semi-open primaries, they allow an unenrolled voter to vote in one party or the other's primary. They don't allow you to vote in a primary for a different party, so you can't cross over, for instance, if you're a registered Democrat and vote at the Republican primary or vice versa. But we do think it's really important because it is, it does expand voter access, voter participation in the process. one thing in particular is that young voters very often, enter as unenrolled voters and don't enroll till later. But by being unenrolled voters, they're effectively excluded from the primary process, which in some place can effectively be the election. So this is something we plan to advocate on this year, and we certainly encourage you all to contact your legislators. But if you're Senator Maxman, you're probably in a pretty good spot already.
Can I just say one thing about that, Will?
Yes.
In the state of Maine, the unenrolled voters are a huge number. I mean,
Yes.
they're almost the same number of unenrolled voters as Republican voters, I think. So that is a huge number of people who are not able to vote in a primary.
Mm-hmm. And I think with good reason, Maine is proud of its political independence. And also, a group we do hear is affected by this is voters who think of themselves in the middle, who would, like to be able to choose based on the candidates in a particular election that suit them, because they don't neatly fall into one of two categories. And these voters are almost, punished for moderation in a way that excludes them from the process. So we're excited to be working on this. So let me go ahead. I see I have some questions coming into the chat, so I will try to get to those very quickly. I'm just going to put a couple of links in the chat. So this first one is just a link to the League of Women Voters Take Action page, and there we have some templates for contacting your legislator, some information for if you want to write a letter to the editor or anything like that. The second thing I'll put in here is something that this is the best email you can sign up for if you're interested in this stuff. Go to our sign up page and make sure you check the Under the Dome. And this is what has our weekly updates of what's coming up in the legislature, what's going on nationwide. I don't write this, but I'm in awe that it gets put together and it's so comprehensive every week. So I really encourage you all to sign up for that. Yeah, that's actually, and then I'll just put my email in there too, so folks can have that right now. And feel free to email me, especially if you need any tips for writing a letter to the editor, or for contacting your legislator, or for writing testimony, anything like that. I'm more than happy to be a resource.
Something else too, I will add, Will, to that is if you're a member of a group that would like Will to come and speak, that may be a nonpartisan group, I'm sure he'd be happy to do that. So
yes, we do a lot of that. I spoke actually to the Waldo County Democrats about national popular vote last week, and we do a lot of Rotary clubs and libraries and other organizations as well. So we welcome all organizations, partisan or not, to discuss our issues.
okay, so the question time is here, and again, if you unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand. I think I got word that Helen Reserve had her hand raised and I didn't see it last time around. So Helen, maybe it was a question for Secretary Bellows, but I think you could probably ask it now if you're still interested. It hasn't been answered yet.
Helen, you need to unmute.
Oh.
What do we do? Can you hear me?
Yes.
What do we do about all the misinformation that's out there? And how do we combat that? I mean, I know you're putting out information, but I work for a food pantry and I can't tell you the number of people that say, I can't get a vaccine because I had another flu vaccine in December, or I can't get a vaccine because I hear it's going to give me the disease or whatever. And it's the same thing about H.R.1. I mean, how do we combat all this misinformation?
So this is. Oh, I'll let Secretary Bellows go first if you'd like. This was a question for her.
You go first, Will.
Sure. So this is such a big question. And it's one of the most important questions of our time. And one of the things that the League is very very strong on advocating for is civics education. Whenever a bill, along with all the voting bills, we're always watching when a bill on civics education comes up. We do a lot of presentations to high school classes. We've been registering voters in high school classes for years. We think that engagement in the civic process is a really important part of this. As a specific thing, I'll just mention that we have a radio show that our Down East chapter does. It's called the Democracy Forum, and it's a really great show that goes kind of into these questions quite a bit. I think the show last week was on conspiracy theories and just some of the academic research around how those happen and what can be done to fight them. So I'll find that link and post it in the chat too, because there's some really great materials to do on that.
Thank you.
And I don't have a lot more to add, except I think each of us plays a role, right? As secretary, I think having really strong public communications and very decisively and clearly confronting misinformation. But I think in our own lives, it really is important to interrupt, to question, to then educate, and to amplify accurate information, because we see it in our own friend and family networks. And so as tempting as it might be to ignore it or hope that it will fall by the wayside of its own weight, I think unfortunately what we saw with the events of January 6th is that misinformation and disinformation festers. And this week, the Department of Homeland Security held a briefing for election administrators across the country and talked about how disinformation was a tactic of outside foreign actors, that they weren't trying to hack into emails this time. They were trying to sow specific lies to, and it's a real threat to democracy.
One other thing I'll mention is, I'm remembering this now, Shenna's comment about meeting with the clerks reminded me of this, because we were talking to the clerks. We've been meeting with them regularly as well, and we were talking to them about this disinformation issue, and one of them shared with us that something she does to anyone who expresses doubts about absentee voting is she offers to show them how we actually process absentee ballots here in the state of Maine, a clear walkthrough of that process. And when people see how it's actually done, she says they almost always come out going like, wow, okay, there's no fraud here. This is a secure system. And sometimes it really, you can't do that for every single person, but anyone who'll take up a clerk on that offer, and any clerk willing to do that, goes a long way towards, debunking one person's network, hopefully, on that.
That'll help a lot, because he'll pass it on to somebody else and somebody else.
Exactly.
That'll be good. Thank you.
So let's see.
I saw
any other questions? Will,
I saw one asking if the national popular vote requires a simple majority or 2/3.
Yes.
And that just requires a simple majority by both chambers and then a signature by the governor. And that's important to know, because there are aspects of bills that we support and that we testify for on every time, but haven't risen to the top of our priorities list because they require that 2/3 threshold. So we encourage everyone to contact their representatives, encourage them to support them, but something that requires a simple majority certainly is an easier lift than something with a 2/3 requirement.
Okay, I think Jeff Bates, you have a question, so go ahead and.
Nope.
Secretary Bellows has to, she just knocked off. Never mind.
So, am I wrong? I guess.
I
was actually wondering, so has Governor Mills had stated where she stands on the national popular vote?
We haven't seen anything publicly. I'll mention this is the one issue that the league is very focused on the grassroots side. So, were it to pass the legislature, I'm sure we would train all of our constituent contact, all of our public education, all of our advocacy on efforts on getting the governor to sign it, but we don't actually know where she stands at this point.
Tom Eichler, I think, has a question.
A question, question for Will. How close are other states, or what are the states that are close to passing the national popular vote proposal?
So there's a few states right now that I know are, targets nationwide. The closest one I can think of is actually my former home state, Virginia. And this year in the legislature, it was actually pulled from committee because they were apparently one vote short of having enough to get it out of committee. And Virginia is a very closely divided Senate, so that probably means they were 1 to 3 votes short of being able to pass it out of the whole legislature. So Virginia is probably the closest one. There's a few other states I think that are seen as pretty promising too, but Maine is top 1, 2, or 3, I would say. Virginia and Nevada would probably be the other 2.
Okay, thank you.
Robin Glassman, go right ahead. You have a question?
Yes, I'm not sure if I'm understanding correctly. Would this eventually eliminate the Electoral College?
So it wouldn't eliminate the Electoral College as a structure. What it would do is it would make states that are members of this compact would, once it hits 270 electoral votes, the electors that they send to vote in December, as we all got a very good civics lesson about this year, they would all be obligated to vote for the winner of the national popular vote. So not whoever got the most votes in their state, but across the nation. And because there would be 270 electoral votes of states in it, they would be guaranteed that there would be 270 electoral votes going to the candidate who got the most votes across all 50 in DC. I know that abolishing the Electoral College is a goal that many people have, and it's a league position as well. We support that, but like I said, 2/3 is a high bar. 2/3 plus 3/4 of states ratifying a constitutional amendment at the federal level is an even higher bar. So we support this as a realistic goal for the short term on reforming how we select the president.
Will, on your website, does it list some of the misconceptions and how you can respond to them?
We have whole pages on that, and I'm actually going to put one more link in here. I keep putting in so many links, and I see if I can find it really quickly. But we have a Facebook page as well. It's Mainers for National Popular Vote, and this is a page that we run. And so we post on there all the time about, debunking myths, sharing articles, keeping people up to date on where the bill stands. So that's a great resource as well for getting some of that information about debunking myths.
And I noticed that Representative Holly Stover is, I believe, here, and I think she voted for it last year, so I'm sure she'll be supporting it again.
Thank you.
I'm reminded to, if you came late to this, you can ask a question by taking yourself off mute and your name will rise to the top, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. Hopefully I'll see it. Raise your hand with the little gizmo that's part of Zoom, that is. Let's see, Joe Gutentag, do you have a question for Will?
Yes, maybe you answered this. Where do you stand on state compacts and as opposed to your national proposal? Maybe you could explain what these state compacts are.
So if I'm understanding right, are you referring to the fact that the national popular vote is an agreement between states and each state joins it? Oh, you're on mute now. Oh.
It would be a proposal where a group of states would agree that their total popular vote would control all of their electoral votes. The electoral votes would remain, but whatever the group of states' popular votes would be, would therefore control the electoral votes.
So the distinction, I think, if I'm understanding right with the national popular vote, is that it's, even though it's, you know, simply a group of states and it's not necessarily all 50 states, it takes the popular vote from all 50 states plus DC, whereas what you're describing might be just those states' votes, popular votes.
But would that be a starting point anyway?
You know, I think that that would pose some challenges because it wouldn't make every vote equal across the country. What works with one of the reasons the national popular vote works so well is whether or not a state is a participant in the national popular vote compact, their votes for the purposes of determining who becomes the next president, each person who casts a vote, which is the best way to think of it, not even, you know, person in X state or Y state, but each person across the country, their vote is counted equally. So that's why we support this method.
Good answer.
Mary and Walt, I think one of you has a question.
Yeah, I've often thought that one way to encourage people to vote is to get a sample ballot in the hands of prospective voters obviously before the election. Is that a valid assumption? And if so, how can that be done on a local basis? And also, how can we get the results of the election posted in the town office so that people can see who voted or who received votes?
Mm-hmm. I feel like you must have gotten a sneak peek at my testimony for tomorrow, because there's a bill tomorrow. There's a bill tomorrow on having unofficial election results posted. Because, you know, right now we find out from the Bangor Daily News or the Associated Press, there's no kind of official method for it. And so, you know, something that the league feels very strongly about is that information on elections, whether that's results or sample ballots or how to vote, all of that, that information disseminated by, you know, our election officials, by our clerks and the Secretary of State, we think that that's the way voters trust it the most. That's the best way for building voter trust, is when that comes from those people. So we really do support methods to do this. Now, as has been referenced a couple of times, Maine is a bit behind technologically in some ways, and I would say that there's some resources that the Secretary of State's office has been asking for and will continue to ask for to be able to do more of this work. So that's just to say that I don't know if that's something that can be implemented tomorrow, but is something that we're really, really pushing for, and we really do think is an important thing that you know, election officials across the state should be constantly thinking about how to get voters more information.
How about the sample ballot?
Sample ballots, that's an interesting one. They're technically required to post something at the town office 7 days before the election, but the clerks we've talked to have told us that, you know, no one really looks at that. It's something that some other states do, particularly states that mail more ballots out to voters. They tend to mail out sample ballots as well. So this is something, you know, I think that if the resources were there, we would really, really like to see as well.
The newspapers, I think, tend to print them. At least that's my recollection. I believe the Lincoln County News and the Booth Bay Register. Let's see. Am I missing any questions here? That so here Mary has written that Noblesboro always posts the town votes after they finish counting, and some clerks do that. In fact, sometimes we've sent runners around to see what that list says at the end of a long night of counting. But it'd be great to have a much more systematic way to.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between posting them and posting them prominently, not behind the door or something like
That's
that.
true. That's very true.
And if I might, Barb, I would also add that many of the town clerks will take email addresses for people who want to be receiving the unofficial election results, but they have tallied that has not yet been certified to the Secretary of State's office and all, but it is their reckoning from the counting that was done at your office of what the outcome is locally. So you can get on a list to receive that email from the town clerk in most communities.
And I will add that the Lincoln County Democratic Campaign Committee also is on that list. So we try to get the word out as quickly as we can, but it's not the same as coming from the Secretary of State's office, certainly. Let's see. Kelly says that you can find sample ballots on the Maine Voter Information Lookup Service, and she put the link in the chat too, if you want to take a look at that. Okay. Are there any other questions out there? I don't see any hands raised. Is everybody's curiosity about elections and voting satisfied? It looks like it maybe is for the evening. So Will, I really appreciate you joining us. That was really interesting. You know, we tend to be a little complacent here in Lincoln County because we have great clerks generally and feel pretty comfortable about things, but both you and Secretary Bellows did give us some things to think about and ways that we really do need some improvement, and especially if we're going to get to be state #1 for turnout.
Let's be #1. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me, and don't hesitate to reach out anytime. I love talking about this stuff, so happy to help with anyone who'd like to get more involved.
Thanks.
Thank you, Will. And let's have a round of applause. You're welcome to unmute for that.
All right, I'll stick around for the applause.
Thank you. Bellows, who had to leave us around 8 o'clock as well.